good morning. And if we've never met, my name is Powell. I'm one of the pastors here. And I want to jump us right into today's topic by asking you a question. And here it is. Ready? How many of you would say that one of your happy places is sitting beside a swimming pool? Maybe a pool like that. Maybe with family around. It's on a Saturday afternoon. You've got your friends, you've got your family, you've got a grill. If you don't like your friends or family, your pool imagination is a pool all by yourself with a grill and with your drinks, right? And you are just relaxing and you're sitting at this pool and you are taking it all in. And who can tell me what the best ever swimming pool is? You're thinking, am I supposed to answer him? In my opinion, I'll tell you, the best swimming pool is your neighbor's pool, right? Your in-laws' pool, well, maybe not. They may expect you to help on that one. The community pool, the resort pool. You know that pool that you're sitting at on a Saturday afternoon when all your chores are done, the lawn's cut, no more work emails, the laundry's done, the groceries are already bought, and you're just like, we got nothing to do and all day to do it in, and you would say, I could just hang out there forever and ever. For Amy and I, we are those kind of pool people, right? I call that like we're the neighbor's pool people. We just grab a little something, maybe take a watermelon over, but we just grab our towel and plop down as if that pool looks like that every single minute of the day. For Amy and I, our life took a little turn when we went from being the neighbor pool people to we bought a home in Chattanooga, and that's actually our pool. That's the pool that we bought, inherited, absorbed. I don't know, but that pool is an 18 feet wide, 35 feet long. It is huge. It's 8 feet deep. We love the pool, and to get to right there, we had some great days in and around that pool. But let me tell you, we didn't start there. Right, we moved in the spring and everybody was telling me, hey, it's time to open your pool, it's time to open your pool, it's time to open your pool. And I'm thinking, I've never owned a pool. I don't know what it means to open a pool. And I don't think I have the tools. I don't think I have the resources. I definitely don't have the knowledge, but I got a pool. So we went and I told Amy, I said, okay, it's time to open the pool. So I went and looked at the tarp. It was a horrible tarp. It had half fallen in. I mean, when we bought the pool, we bought the house from the guy, the last thing he told me when we closed on the deal, he said, good luck with that pool. I was like, come on. So I pulled the cover back on the pool, and this is actually what that pool looked like. Now, that's not my pool. I was so flabbergasted in the moment of what I experienced that I was not prepared for, that there was no way I was going to take a picture. But what I realized, it was green, it was full of filth and leaves and muck and dirt and nast, and I was like, okay, I've got to get this from this to pristine water if we're going to be pool people and invite people over. So the first thing I realized was, I don't have the tools. I had like a serving size plate basket thing on an extension pole, and I found myself going to the 8 foot deep because all the leaves went down the slope into the 8 foot section, and I'm over there like dipping in like this and pulling out, and I would take it and I would sling it, flop, and it would all over the yard. And I thought, I'm gonna have to clean that up later too. And the more I stirred it, the worse it got. It just kept getting, I thought, how can there be this much? I had no idea I wasn't going to get in that nasty water. And there was a moment, there were lots of moments that I said, forget it. I'm done. We're not going to be pool people. We're going to be those people that have this tarp that spreads out across the back of our yard that might have a pool in it, but we are not going to be pool people. I'm going to have to tell Amy and the boys, this is a no-go. I'm going to stay with status quo. I'm going to leave it the way it is, and everybody's just going to have to deal with it whether you like it or not. Have you ever find yourself in a spot where you're like, I'm just done. I don't know what to do. I don't have the tools. I don't have the resources. I don't like where I am, but it is my reality. And you kind of have to do something with it. You know, when I think about my first experience and every experience after that, when it was time to open up the pool each year, that experience is kind of like what some of us experience in our lives. Because there's moments when we pull back the tarp and peer into our lives, and what we hope we see is that pristine, nice, beautiful pool. But what we actually see is this. Something growing inside of us, and we don't like it, but it's there, and we're kind of forced to do something with it, but we don't really know what to do. So as we're in this series called Kudzu, that's what we are talking about. We're talking about this idea that what takes root takes over. Just like the algae and everything else that was in there took over my pool, there are things in our life that can take over. We related it to kudzu because kudzu is one of those things that once it takes off, it takes over. And if you missed last week, I encourage you to go back and listen to Jeremy's message. He did an amazing job, not only educating us about kudzu, right? Our family actually had a family friend who lived in Chicago pretty much their whole life, and they had no idea what kudzu was. They walked away going, that's what that stuff's called. Kudzu. And does anybody remember how deep, Jeremy told us this last week, how deep do the roots grow on kudzu and with kudzu? In kudzu, with kudzu. How deep? Somebody shout it out. Come on, help me out. 12 feet. Thank you for listening. 12 feet deep. Can you imagine something growing 12 feet deep? You relate that to ourselves, that when things grow inside of us, if there were 12 feet of filth and muck and nast in us, and sometimes it feels like that's what happens. Right? But the thing is that we asked and said, okay, we asked ChatGPT, what can we do to resolve this? What's the best solution? And the reality is there's not much, but the best thing we came up with was buy a goat. Get you a grazing animal, let it graze, let it eat. But I don't know how you get 12 feet of root out of anything. But the reality is when we look at this idea of what takes root takes over, we all have things in our life that can take root within us. We're all one episode, we're all one situation, we're all one experience away from something triggering something in our life that begins to take root, and it begins to change who we are from the inside out. It starts in our heart, and then it works its way out into the world around us and everybody who's engaged in our lives. So what we want to do over the next several weeks is we're going to look at several emotions. Emotions that engage with each and every one of us in our lives. Because the reality is, regardless of where you would say you are on your journey today, if you're saying, hey, I'm not sure I even believe who Jesus is, or you would say, you know what, I'm trying to figure out what my faith, my growing faith looks like after decades of being a Christ follower. Emotions do not care. They don't care what you believe. They don't care where you're from. They don't care your gender. They don't care your political preference. Emotions attack all of us. So we want to talk about it. We want to talk about some emotions that we think that if we ignore will slowly take over. And in some of our lives, you would say, I'm already wrestling with these. Be it fear, anxiousness, rejection, insecurity, stress. We all deal with them. We all deal with them. So what we want to do is look at it and say, okay, what does science teach us? Jeremy and I spent some time with a licensed professional counselor so that we can understand the science behind this. We can understand what the counseling world says as we deal with our emotions. Also, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what are stories that are in Scripture. Today, we're going to look at one of a guy who had every reason to be bitter. And we're going to see how they managed their life. And then we're going to look at what does that mean for us. And then also through this, you're going to hear us talk about what's Jesus' perspective on this. And how can we take and apply resources in order to tackle the emotions that life throws at us. So that's our plan. And we're going to start this morning talking about bitterness. Our working definition for bitterness is this. Bitterness is a complex, multi-layered emotion that has been described as a mixture of disappointment, disgust, and anger. I'm going to come back to this a lot. You may want to snap a pic of that because when you leave, I hope you may not need a pic, but you'll be able to know when we talk about bitterness and you go, that person's bitter. You can say to the person with you, you know, that's a multi-layered emotion that's tied up with disgust, disappointment, and anger. There's way more in it, but that's definitely a huge part of what is there. And I want to pause and say this morning, if you would say you are walking in a season of bitterness, we want you to know it's complex. It's very complex. Bitterness is not one of those things you turn the light switch on and you turn the light switch off. Bitterness is something that builds over time and then it dissipates over time. And whatever it is that you're walking through, there's not enough time for me to unpack everything about bitterness. And there may be times where you say, well, he just glazed right over that. But that's because we just don't have time to unpack it during this morning. But hear me say, we fully understand that what you're walking through is complex, multi-layered emotion. And typically when it comes to bitterness, the person that disappointed you, disgusted you, or angered you at this level is someone that was close in your life. It was someone on your inner circle. It could have been a family member. It could have been a personal relationship, a business relationship, but it's someone that you trusted, that you let in. And not just once and not just twice, but many, many times they hurt you. And not just over 1 week or 2 weeks, but it could have transpired over a long period of time. And it began to impact your life, and you're still dealing with it today. And we're sorry for what you're walking through, and we know it's tough. When we meet someone who's bitter, there are some common characteristics. And you may be going, oh, I know, because maybe someone close to you is in this stage of life. But those who are bitter typically tend to be they're a negative person. They're quick to find fault, and they overreact. Whatever the situation is, if there's at least a little bit of space for it to go negative, they go negative. If everything is going well, there's one piece that didn't go exactly right, they're going to quickly run to that, and they're going to find the fault that's in it. And then when the circumstances hit, and when they react, that reaction's typically not small. That reaction can be an explosion, way more than anybody expected. Because see, what we find is that when whatever's in us, this bitterness takes root, it begins to take over. But what we hope that we find is that we're all thinking, this is what we're going to see. When we pull that top back and we look deep inside, we're like, no, this is going to be great. I'm doing okay. But the reality is many times when we look inside, this is what we see when we begin to explore. Why do we feel the way we feel? Jeremy did a great job last week unpacking that really it's an issue of our heart. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything flows from it. Right? When the bitterness takes root, it lands in our heart. And it causes us to be a person that we don't want to be. Even in the moment, we know I'm feeling this way, but I don't want to. But because it's so rooted deep into our heart, we can't get past it. And the bitterness grows and grows and grows. And I've been there. I've had more than one season of bitterness. But around 2008, I had probably my biggest season of bitterness. And for those that were in the business world around 2005, 6, 7, you know the economy was doing great. People were buying things and flipping them, and it felt like everybody around you was making money. And some people that were close to me, close to Amy and I, my wife, we had vacationed with them. They were close to us. They said, hey, let's create a business partnership, and let's go buy a condo, and let's flip that thing, and let's all make money. I remember saying to Amy, why would this person hurt us? We trust them. They're close. Well, there's no reason they would hurt us. So we went into the business deal with 2 other business partners. And shortly after the papers were signed, it felt like the ink wasn't even dry. The 2 business partners walked away. And the last conversation I had with one of them was in my front yard, which is a little offensive. And he said, everyone needs to experience bankruptcy once. And this is your chance. And he walked away. And the disappointment, the disgust, the anger, and the anger, and the anger grew. Even now, I have chills as I tell that story. And I'm so thankful for my wife, Amy, for sticking beside me. And I'm so thankful that we didn't file for bankruptcy. But for 13 or 14 years, every month, we paid somehow through God's grace. We're able to pay this mortgage that we totally couldn't afford. But I was bitter. Who I became, what flowed from my heart, wasn't who I wanted to be. But I'm thankful for the small group I was in. I'm thankful that there are people that were around my life. I'm thankful for the counseling sessions that I went to. For some of you today, that might be exactly what you need, is what I needed. I needed that professional counselor to help me understand what I was feeling. I'm thankful for God's grace, for how he secured and saved our marriage. I'm thankful for God's grace, for how we're able to pay for that mortgage. I look back on it, I still don't get it. And I'm thankful today that I can stand here and say, well, yes, when I tell that story, I get riled up, but I'm not bitter. When I see the person's face that stood in my front yard, I can keep moving forward. And I can keep moving forward with where God has me and how God used us through that. The thing is, we all have stories. What I want to share with you this morning is a story of a guy named Joseph. Joseph's story, he has every right to be bitter. One of the things, if you go back and read all of the story of Joseph, it never says that he was bitter. But as we read through his story, from Genesis chapter 37 through chapter 50, it's a lot of verses, a lot of passage. We see every reason with my perspective, and I think you'll see the same, that Joseph should have been a bitter person based on what went on in his life. So I encourage you, if you love history, go read Genesis chapter 37 through 50 and get the whole story of Joseph. It's absolutely amazing, and how you get to see how he lived out. He lived to 110 years old and lived a very amazing life. And you can get the entire story and you can see how God was with him, even though he has a lot of disappointment, disgust, and anger. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to roll us through the story of Joseph. It's going to be kind of like the speed round. And you're going to may think, well, he left out this, he left out that. There's no way to cover it all. That's why I encourage you to go back and read it. So here's where we are. We're going to jump in and we're going to pick up Joseph in chapter 37 of Genesis when he was 17 years old. So Joseph, at age 17, he had 11 brothers, and his father, he was his father's favorite. Now, if any of you know what it's like not to be your father's favorite, it definitely gives you reason to hate the one that is the favorite, right? And so for Joseph's sake, his 11 brothers hated him. His 11 brothers hated him, and one of the reasons they hated him was because there was a time in Joseph's life where he had a dream, and he told his brothers, you know what you're going to do one day, big brothers? You're going to bow to me. Remember that. That's going to come up later in our time together. But then on top of that, Joseph's dad said, hey, little buddy, I need you to go check on all your big brothers and see how they were doing herding the sheeps. If it didn't make him even more mad, if it didn't make them more mad, that absolutely frustrated them. So Joseph took off. He took off to go find his brothers. And his brothers, as they're there, they see him and they say, you know what? We hate him so much. We are going to kill him. Now, thankfully, one of his brothers had a cooler head, and he said, you know what? This is our dad's favorite. We can't kill him. We love dad. We don't love him, but we're not going to kill him because we love dad. So the one looked around, and he said, we'll throw him in that empty well right over there. And they threw him in the empty well and left him in a pit. The story tells us that what he actually did at that point is they stopped and had lunch. Were they like, oh, I'm hungry after throwing my brother in a pit. Let's eat PB&J. Whatever their deal was, they sat and had lunch, and then along came a group of travelers. They realized these group of travelers were in the slave trade. So the great idea being, we're not going to kill him, but we're going to throw him into slavery. We're going to sell him to this group, and he is going to be sold into slavery for the rest of his life. Okay, let's pause right there. In this story of Joseph today, I want you to be Joseph. So if you were Joseph, you were thrown in a pit by your brothers. You have no idea how long you're going to be in the pit. You can't get out of the pit. You're yelling, let me out, and all you hear is them having lunch and snacking on some chips. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, great, I'm coming out of the pit. And then when you come out of the pit, you're sold into slavery. Joseph, how would you feel? Would you be disappointed? Would you be disgusted? Would you be angry? I would be. My brothers, I have 2 brothers. I can't imagine my brothers doing that to me. But that's what happened. They sold him into slavery. So we're going to pick back up with Joseph. It didn't end there. His story didn't get better there. Once they sold him into slavery, they sold him in. He got then sold a second time into Egypt. He sold into a guy's home named Potiphar. Potiphar saw Joseph and how good Joseph was. Remember, God's still showing favor on Joseph through all of this, but he has every right to be disgusted, disappointed, and angry. But Potiphar raises Joseph to the number 2 in his home, and he's overseeing the entire home. And then Potiphar's wife catches eyes for Joseph. He's about 25, 28 years old at this point. He sees him. She sees him. She entices him. She's like, hey, come to my bedroom. It says that she asked him to lie with her. And if you're wondering, does that mean what I think it means? It does. What goes on today went on then. But Joseph said, I'm not doing it. I will not do it. And then the wife went to her husband and said, guess what he did, although he didn't. And Potiphar says, I choose to believe my wife. And then Joseph is put in prison. Joseph is put in prison and he's forgotten for 2 years. Okay, Joseph, how y'all feeling? Are you disappointed? Are you disgusted? Are you angry? See, we know what the story says. We know that he stays there for 2 years. Joseph does not know how long he's going to be in jail. You do not know how long you are going to be in prison. And the jail that they were in doesn't look like our jails. I got a feeling it was dark and cold and damp and nasty. And that's where he was. He thought maybe forever. See, the thing for Joseph in that moment, as you read the story, you'll read how he continued to live his life. And the reality for all of us is that when we go through these seasons of bitterness, we have to continue to live our lives, right? And then what we do with that is we end up actually spinning off the portion of us that is wounded. We basically divide ourselves in 2. And over here on this side is the wounded part, because we have to continue with our life. We have to continue making sure groceries are bought, making sure the clothes are washed, making sure the laundry's done, making sure we go to work, making sure we go to small group, making sure the pool gets clean so we can sit by the pool, making sure all those things in life that have to happen. While at the same time, there's this portion of us over here that is bitter and hurt. Because remember, bitterness, it ramps up and it ramps down. It's not a light switch on, light switch off. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to live here. You can't, because life keeps moving. And the fact that it's typically someone in your inner circle, someone close to you that hurt you, sometimes you can't get away from it and you're stuck in it. So the best thing that we can do is spin that portion off and let it sit over there and kind of live 2 separate lives. Everybody thinks we're good over here, but this thing over here is really like a hot mess. And the longer that this is unreconciled, the longer that this is not addressed, the longer that this wound stays in place, the worse and the deeper that the roots get into our life and the more that it takes over. Ultimately, we put ourselves in prison. We put ourselves in chains because it owns us. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Another way to look at it or to say it is that we take a poison pill and then we think the other person is going to die. See, for me, I would get up and I would take that poison pill expecting those business partners to die. But the reality is they were long gone. They hadn't thought about Powell and Amy Grisham for years, but we did. Every time we paid that mortgage, we thought about it. It was like that bitterness just got touched every single month, every single month, every single month. But they were gone. And we think that our bitterness is going to change them, but it doesn't. We chose to live in chains. what happens is, then when somebody brings it up, hey, you're not the same person you've always been. We begin to give answers like, well, I'm justified because of what they did. And you don't understand. You just don't understand what happened. Or we say things like, you could not have handled what I experienced. And the reality is, if you are in this season and you find yourself bitter and you could share your story, probably each and every one of us would say, you're right, I could not handle that. I don't know what to do with it. And there we sit, not liking where we are, but it becomes our reality. Now, the great thing about today is that we're not going to stop here, right? That's the part that's like the reality for some of us or someone you know, or it could be the reality that you're going to experience a few years from now. And maybe you need to file this away and say in a few years, you're like, oh, remember that thing he talked about bitterness, disappointment, disgust, and anger? That's where we are. But how we're going to move in the direction for our rest of our time is we're going to jump back into the life of Joseph. We're going to look at where Joseph's life turns. We're going to see how he interacts with what happens next, how God engages with him, and then how do we apply all this? So we're about to pick the pace back up. We're about to jump back in to the book of Genesis. And remember, Joseph, you've been sitting in prison for 2 years. You didn't know how long you were going to be there, but that's how long you're there. And now Pharaoh calls for Joseph to come out of prison. Pharaoh's the head guy over all of Egypt. And Pharaoh had a dream. Remember who can explain dreams? Joseph. He figured out Joseph was in there. He's like, bring that guy up. Joseph comes, stands before Pharaoh. Before he tells him anything about his dream, Joseph said to him, he says, hey, the answers I'm going to give you, they come from God. They're not from me. And then Pharaoh tells him the dream. Joseph absolutely nailed it. He explained it to him, and Pharaoh took action. And here's what he told him. He said, Pharaoh, what's about to happen in all of Egypt is there's going to be 7 years of robust crops. We're going to have bumper crops, more food than we know what to do with. And then we're going to have 7 years of famine. People are going to starve, and you're going to think there never was any food here to begin with. And Joseph, he's like, well, I'm out of prison. I might as well be bold at this point. The worst they can do is throw me back in prison. He said, and Pharaoh, I'm going to tell you what you need to do. You need to pick someone to oversee the 7 years of harvest and then to redistribute the food back to people during the 7 years of the famine. Pharaoh looks at him. Joseph was an impressive guy. God's favor was with him. And Pharaoh says, you're the man. He looks to Joseph and he says, now you are the number 2 guy in all of Egypt. There's Pharaoh and there's Joseph. How you feel, Joseph? I feel pretty good at that point. But I might still have this part that's spun off over here because I still haven't figured out anything with my brothers. So the famine is in full speed. The famine is going. And what I want to look at is what Joseph did when he saw his brothers coming, because everyone had to come to Joseph to get food. And what Joseph did is he oversaw the distribution of every single food item that went out into Egypt. And so in Genesis chapter 42, verse 7, this is what we see. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, so from afar he saw them, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. See, they didn't know him. He wasn't speaking their language. They just thought it was a guy, and he treated them rough. Go read all the chapters, and you'll see what he did. He ultimately did give them food. He sent them back home with some specific instruction for when they came back the next time, because he knew they were going to need more food. At this point, was Joseph still bitter? To us, it seems like he had every right to be by the way he was treated. But he goes on. Let's look at Genesis chapter 45. Verse 4, this is the second time that they've came to gather food. This time, Joseph sees them. And what he does is he asks them to come to his home, to his personal home, to sit with him. Now remember, Joseph, you don't know that he's your brother. All you know is that the second in command of all of Egypt just invited you to his house. This is either going to be something really good or really bad. So when he arrives, Joseph then said to his brothers, "Come close to me." They're still confused. And then when he had done so, he said, "Luke, I am your father." I'm just kidding. That'd be funny though. But he did say, "I am your brother." And in that moment, they might have wished they were talking to Darth Vader, because they might have thought, we're dead. Life is done, because that's the guy we threw in a ditch, into a pit. That's the guy we sold into slavery. And if you wonder how did they feel, the next verse tells us. He continues writing, "And now do not be distressed." Do you know why he said don't be distressed? Because they were distressed. When they looked up, can you imagine their face? They're like, that's our brother. He's the number 2 guy in all of Egypt. He controls the food. He controls our food. He can throw us into prison. He can have us have our heads cut off. He can do whatever he wants. So they're distressed. They're fearful. But he says, don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. In this moment, Joseph has all the power. He still has disappointment, disgust, and anger. And I'm not so sure that I could do what he just did, because what Joseph just did is, in the moment, he forgave them. He absolutely forgave those who gave him every reason to be bitter. Forgiveness is the only thing that can uproot bitterness. There's no other solution. Did you catch that? Forgiveness is the only thing that can uproot bitterness. But here's the reality. To forgive is hard. Because what we feel like when we forgive is that we have to let people off the hook. What we feel like is that when we forgive, we have to let people back in our inner circle. What we feel like when we forgive is that all of a sudden justice is not done. And I get that. For those of you who would say, hey, I've not put my trust in Jesus, for you to choose to forgive, you have to reach really deep down to find a reason to forgive. And I would say to those of us that have put our trust in Jesus, for us, the reason we forgive is because Jesus forgave us. And when we look at all the miracles that Jesus accomplished during his life, the odds of us doing those miracles are about 0. But there is one thing that we can do that makes us more Christ-like than anything else, and that's to forgive. Because we are never more Christ-like than when we forgive others. I go back to bitterness is complex. And today, if I wrapped up our time and said, those who are in a season of bitterness, forgive, you would be even more bitter. Now you would be bitter at me. So what we want to do today is I want to wrap up our time together with some steps, a process for forgiveness. You may want to snap pics of this, because even if you're like, hey, bitterness is not my thing, you may know that your thing is you need to forgive. So here is a process to help us walk through forgiveness. Step number 1 is to realize forgiveness is a process. As believers, if you're a Christ follower, we are told to be quick to forgive, and we are. And we are quick to make that step toward forgiveness because we are forgiven. But we have to realize that forgiveness is a process. And the emotions that you're feeling are real. Don't ignore your emotions. Know that they are there as an indicator that something is going on inside you. The second step, acknowledge what was taken or lost. Until you acknowledge that you've lost something. I know what my family lost during my season of bitterness. I had to process that, because until we process what was taken or lost, we can't grieve, because you don't know what you're grieving. So as you move through that process, slow down and determine what was lost. The third is to walk through the grief process. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to go through denial. It's okay to bargain. But what my counselor friend told me, he said, it's not until we touch anger that we can experience grief. He said in his office, when people finally get mad at what they've lost, then the emotions flow and the grief begins. So go through the process and learn what you've lost. The fourth, don't harbor. Don't harbor what happened deep inside. When you harbor that, when you push it down, inevitably it's going to come out at the most inopportune time, at about 10 times the volume, 10 times the impact that you ever imagined. Be quick to forgive and walk through the process of forgiveness. I'm going to wrap up our time here with 2 questions and then a couple thoughts. The first question, and this is for those who would say you're in a season of bitterness. The question that I ask you is, how long do you want to live like this? It's a choice. I had a choice. You have a choice. The second is, what have you gained from living like this? What have you gained from living in chains? What have you gained by taking the poison pill day after day after day after day? But imagine if you could grieve what you lost. Imagine processing the disappointment, the disgust, and the anger. Imagine what it would look like if your wound was healed. Imagine what it would look like when this piece that you've spun off many years ago, maybe decades ago, you actually bring back into your life and you live full and intact. It is possible. Because when you make that choice and you do, you will begin to grow, and you will grow in ways that you never thought possible again, and in ways that you thought had died, along with the bitterness that you experienced in life. Let me pray for us. God, this morning, we thank you. Thank you for preserving stories like Joseph, so that we can see what it looks like, not just today, but God, what we are walking through is nothing new, and we're not alone, and we're not the only one. God, thank you that even through our hard times, you are with us. God, today, help us all to be quick to forgive and move through the process of forgiveness so that we can heal. God, thank you that you love us and that you are with us and that you are for us. We pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen.